Welcome back to another deep exploration into the Star Wars universe. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most morally complex aspects of the entire saga: the clone army that fought for the Republic during the Clone Wars. On the surface, these soldiers seem like heroes, brave warriors who defended democracy against the tyranny of the separatists. But when you look deeper, when you really examine what the clones were and how they came to be, you uncover ethical questions so profound they shake the very foundation of what we think we know about the good guys of Star Wars. So settle in as we unravel the uncomfortable truths about manufactured soldiers, programmed loyalty, and the price of convenience in warfare. This is a journey into the gray areas of morality, where even the Jedi found themselves compromised. The genesis of an army. The story of the clone army begins in secrecy and shadow, years before anyone realized what was being created. On a remote world called Camino, a water-covered planet beyond the Outer Rim, something unprecedented was taking place. The Kaminoans, tall and graceful beings with long necks and an almost clinical detachment from emotion, were masters of genetic science. They'd survived their own planetary catastrophe through cloning, learning to replicate and modify life with precision that bordered on artistry. When Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas approached them with a request to create an army for the Republic, the Kaminoans saw it as simply another contract. They didn't concern themselves with the politics or morality of creating millions of sentient beings for the express purpose of warfare. To them, this was business. They were being paid to produce a product, and that product happened to be human beings. But these wouldn't be just any humans. The Kaminoans needed a template, someone whose genetic material would serve as the foundation for an entire army. They found their source in Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter considered one of the most dangerous men in the galaxy. Jango was perfect for their needs. He was skilled, resilient, and most importantly, willing to serve as the genetic donor in exchange for a substantial payment and one special request. He wanted a single, unaltered clone for himself, a son he could raise as his own. That clone became Boba Fett. The cloning process itself was a marvel of biotechnology, but it was also deeply invasive in its modifications. The Kaminoans didn't simply replicate Jango's DNA. They tampered with it, altering the genetic code to serve specific purposes. They engineered accelerated aging so that a clone could grow from embryo to full adult in roughly half the time it would take a naturally born human. This meant that someone who was biologically 20 years old might only be 10 years from their creation. Their entire childhood compressed into a handful of years. The Kaminoans also modified the clones' behavioral traits, engineering them to be more docile and obedient than Django himself. They wanted soldiers who would follow orders without the troublesome independence that might lead to questioning authority. In Attack of the Clones, we hear the Kaminoans proudly explain their work to Obi-Wan Kenobi. They've modified the clones' genetic structure to make them less independent than their host. They're totally obedient, taking any order without question. Think about what that means for a moment. These are human beings, or at least they would have been if not for deliberate genetic tampering, designed to suppress the very qualities we associate with humanity. Free will, independence of thought, the ability to question and choose. All of these were intentionally diminished to create better soldiers. Better, in this case, meaning more compliant. On Kamino, in vast facilities that stretched beneath and above the turbulent oceans, millions of clones were being grown in identical chambers. The Kaminoans oversaw every stage of development with meticulous care, not because they valued these lives individually, but because quality control mattered to their reputation. Each clone represented the Kaminoan commitment to excellence in their craft. The clones were flash-trained, having military tactics and combat skills downloaded into their brains through advanced technology. They learned to operate weapons, pilot vehicles, execute complex maneuvers, all before they'd fully matured physically. Their education was singular in its focus. They weren't taught art or philosophy or any of the myriad subjects that help develop a complete person. They learned war. That was their purpose, their reason for existence. By the time Obi-Wan Kenobi stumbled upon Kamino while investigating an assassination attempt, the clone army was nearly complete. 200,000 units were ready, with 1 million more well on their way. The Kaminoans presented this army as a gift to the Republic, ordered years ago by a Jedi master whose death had been conveniently orchestrated. The whole thing was a trap, of course, orchestrated by Darth Sidious as part of his grand plan to destroy the Jedi and transform the Republic into his empire. But the Jedi didn't know that. All they knew was that a massive droid army was about to attack, and here was a ready-made military force capable of defending the Republic. Time was short. Debate was luxury they couldn't afford. And so the decision was made. The Republic would use the clone army. What nobody stopped to really consider in that moment of crisis was what it meant to use an army of people who'd been created specifically to be used. The question that haunts everything. At the heart of the clone army issue lies a question that's both simple and impossibly complex. Are the clones people? It seems like it should have an obvious answer. They look human. They think. They feel. They form bonds and friendships. They laugh and mourn and sacrifice themselves for each other. How could they be anything but people? Yet the Republic treated them as property. They were assets, equipment, military resources to be deployed and expended as strategic needs demanded. In legal terms, they had no rights. They weren't citizens of the Republic they were fighting to defend. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't choose to leave military service. They were born into the Grand Army of the Republic and would remain soldiers until they died or were deemed no longer useful. This is where the ethical nightmare really begins, because if you accept that the clones are people, that they possess consciousness and selfhood and all the qualities that grant moral status, then what the Republic did was create millions of slaves. Not metaphorical slaves, not people living in slave-like conditions, actual slaves by any reasonable definition of the term. They were owned, they were bought and paid for by the Republic through contracts with Camino. They had no choice in their existence or their role. They couldn't quit, couldn't refuse orders, couldn't choose a different path. The punishment for desertion was death, or reconditioning, a process that stripped away whatever personality and individuality a clone had managed to develop. The Clone Wars animated series makes this explicit in ways the films never quite did. We meet clone troopers who have distinct personalities despite their identical genetics. We watch them choose names for themselves, names that mean something to them. Fives, named because of his designation number. Echo, who follows standard operating procedures. Rex, meaning king or leader. These names are acts of defiance, small claims to individual identity in a system designed to deny them such things. The clones decorated their armor, adding personal touches that distinguished them from their brothers. They formed friendships, developed preferences, told jokes, showed fear and courage, and everything in between. The more we got to know them as individuals, the more uncomfortable their status became. These weren't automatons or droids. These were people whose humanity was being systematically ignored because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the horror of their situation. The Bad Batch takes this even further, showing us clones whose genetic mutations made them different from their brothers. Hunter with his enhanced senses, Tech with his extraordinary intelligence, Wrecker with his immense strength, Crosshair with his perfect aim, and Omega, a female clone who served as a medical assistant on Camino. These clones proved definitively that identical genetics don't produce identical people. Even among the so-called regular clones, the ones without deliberate mutations, personality and individuality emerged. The Kaminoans themselves seemed confused by this. They'd engineered the clones to be uniform, interchangeable. When defects occurred, clones who couldn't meet military standards, the Kaminoans' first instinct was to eliminate them. Clone 99, an older clone with physical deformities, was saved from this fate only through intervention. He ended up doing maintenance work on Camino, forming close bonds with young clones, including the squad that would become the Domino Squad. The fact that the Kaminoans saw these defective clones as failures to be disposed of tells you everything about how they viewed their creations. These weren't people to be cared for or helped. They were products with quality control issues. And the Republic, by using this army, implicitly accepted that framework. The clones were military assets, numbered and tracked, their value measured by their combat effectiveness. In one particularly powerful episode of the Clone Wars, we meet a clone trooper named Slick, who betrays the Republic to the Separatists. When confronted by Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, Slick's reasoning cuts to the core of everything wrong with the clone army. He tells them that it's the Jedi who keep his brothers enslaved, that the clones serve at the Jedi's whim. He wanted something more than the life assigned to him from birth. Slick was treated as a traitor, and his methods were certainly wrong. But his fundamental observation was correct. The clones were slaves. They had no agency over their own lives, no choice in their destiny. Every moment of their existence had been determined by others, from their genetic structure to their training to their deployment in battle. We also meet Cut LaQuain, a clone who deserted and started a new life as a farmer with an adopted family. Cut represents the path not taken, the life that clones could have had if they'd been given freedom. He's happy, fulfilled, living quietly on a remote planet, but he's also living in constant fear of discovery, knowing that if the Republic found him, he'd be dragged back to military service, or worse. The existence of clones like Slick and Cut raises uncomfortable questions. If some clones wanted to leave, wanted lives beyond warfare, how many others felt the same way but never acted on it? How many clones went into battle wishing they could be somewhere else, doing something else, but unable to express that desire because their entire existence was predicated on being soldiers? Throughout the Clone Wars, we see Jedi who clearly recognize the clones' personhood. Anakin treats his men with respect, learns their names, mourns their losses. Plo Koon explicitly tells his troops that they aren't expendable, that they matter to him. Shaak Ti oversees clone training on Kamino and advocates for treating the clones with dignity. These moments are meant to be touching, to show the bonds formed between Jedi and their troops, but there's something deeply troubling about them too, because recognizing someone's personhood while still keeping them enslaved isn't kindness. It's not enough to treat your slaves well. The ethical problem isn't solved by being a considerate master. The only ethical solution is to not have masters and slaves at all. The Jedi saw that the clones were people. They formed genuine friendships with them, and yet they continued to lead them in battle, continued to work within a system that denied these people any real freedom or choice. The best you can say is that the Jedi made a horrible situation slightly less horrible for individual clones. That's not nothing, but it's very far from enough. The slavery question. Let's be completely clear about what we're talking about when we discuss the clone army as slavery. This isn't hyperbole or exaggeration for dramatic effect. By any standard definition, the clones fit the criteria of enslaved people. They were human beings created for the explicit purpose of serving others. They had no choice in their existence or their role. They were legally owned as property of the Republic. They received no compensation for their labor. They couldn't leave their service. They had no legal rights or protections as individuals. Their children, if they'd been allowed to have children, would have been born into the same system. The only real difference between the clone army and historical slavery is that these slaves were manufactured specifically for their role, rather than captured or born into it. But that difference, if anything, makes it worse. At least in historical slavery systems, the enslaved people existed before their enslavement. They had, at some point, been free. The clones never had that. They were born as slaves, would live their entire abbreviated lives as slaves, and would die as slaves. The Jedi's opposition to slavery was well established in Star Wars lore. Qui-Gon Jinn's discomfort with slavery on Tatooine is a plot point in The Phantom Menace. The Jedi Code, at its core, is about freeing people from suffering and oppression. The Jedi saw themselves as protectors of the weak and defenders of justice. Slavery should have been anathema to everything they stood for. And yet, when presented with an army of slaves, the Jedi took command of it. They became the enforcers of that slavery, the generals directing slave soldiers in battle. The cognitive dissonance is stunning. How did the Jedi, an order dedicated to justice and opposed to slavery, reconcile leading a slave army? The answer seems to be that they didn't. Not really. In Attack of the Clones, after the Battle of Geonosis, Yoda's reaction is telling. Obi-Wan says that without the clones, they wouldn't have had victory. Yoda responds that it wasn't a victory. It was a defeat. The Clone War has begun. There's a weight to that moment, a recognition that something terrible has started, that lines have been crossed that shouldn't have been crossed. But that recognition didn't lead to any meaningful action. The Jedi continued to command the clone army throughout the 3-year Clone Wars. They continued to send clone troopers into battle, knowing full well that these men had no choice but to fight. Strategic necessity overrode ethical considerations. The threat of the separatists, the need to defend the Republic, these things became justifications for participating in a fundamentally unjust system. In the expanded universe, now designated as Legends, there were more explicit discussions of this issue. Karen Travis wrote a series of Republic Commando novels that delved deep into clone culture and the ethical problems of their existence. One character, Jedi Knight Barden Jusik, eventually leaves the Jedi Order specifically because he can't reconcile their use of a slave army with their supposed principles. In one powerful scene, Jusik confronts his fellow Jedi, asking how they justify using beings bred without choice and without freedom to fight and die for them. When does the end cease to justify the means, he asks. Where do we draw the line between ourselves and those we find unacceptably evil? It's a devastating critique, made more powerful because it comes from someone within the system. The Jedi Council's response, when they bother to give one, essentially boils down to necessity. The Republic needs defending. The Separatists must be stopped. The clones are here. They exist, and refusing to use them won't unmake them or give them freedom. It's better for the Jedi to lead them, treating them as well as possible, than to abandon them to less scrupulous commanders. This is the utilitarian argument. The idea that the greatest good for the greatest number justifies actions that would otherwise be immoral. By using the clone army, the Jedi prevent the collapse of the Republic and the suffering that would follow. Millions benefit from the stability the clones provide. The clones themselves, 3 million or so, suffer enslavement, but their suffering prevents greater suffering elsewhere. It's a seductive argument, the kind that's been used to justify all sorts of horrors throughout human history. The problem is that it requires placing different values on different lives. It requires saying that the freedom and autonomy of the clones matters less than the security of Republic citizens. It requires treating some people as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that treating people merely as means rather than as ends in themselves is fundamentally immoral. Every person has inherent dignity and worth. Every person deserves to be treated as an autonomous individual capable of making their own choices. Using people purely as tools, even for a good cause, violates their humanity. By that standard, the Jedi's use of the clone army was indefensible. It didn't matter how kind individual Jedi were to their troops. It didn't matter that they tried to minimize casualties or that they genuinely cared about their men. The fundamental arrangement was still using people who had no choice for purposes determined entirely by others. There's also the uncomfortable fact that the clone army made things easier for everyone else in the Republic. Citizens didn't have to worry about conscription or sending their own children to war. The economic cost was high, but that cost was borne collectively through taxes. Nobody in the Republic had to personally sacrifice much of anything because the clones existed to do the sacrificing for them. This is one of the darkest aspects of the whole situation. The clone army allowed the Republic to wage a massive galactic war without most citizens experiencing any direct hardship. The war was fought by people who had no connection to Republic society, no stake in its politics, no say in its decisions. It was warfare outsourced to a manufactured underclass, created specifically to bear the burden that no one else wanted to carry. Compare this to societies that use conscription or volunteer militaries. In those systems, at least in theory, the people who go to war have some connection to the society they're defending. They're citizens with rights, making choices about their lives, even if those choices are constrained by circumstance. Their families have political power, can influence decisions about war and peace. There's at least the possibility of accountability. The clones had none of that. They fought for a republic that didn't recognize them as citizens, that would never ask their opinion about anything, that saw them purely as a military resource. And when the war ended, when Order 66 transformed them from Republic soldiers into Imperial enforcers, they were used again in exactly the same way. Same lack of choice, same lack of freedom, just different masters giving the orders. The Jedi's impossible position. To understand the ethical catastrophe of the clone army, we need to look closely at the Jedi's role in all of this. Because the Jedi aren't one-dimensional villains, heartlessly using slave soldiers. They're complex characters caught in an impossible situation, making terrible choices because all their options are terrible. When Obi-Wan discovers the clone army on Kamino, the Jedi Council is immediately suspicious. Master Windu explicitly states that whoever ordered the army wasn't a Jedi. There's recognition that something strange is happening, that they're being manipulated. But events move too quickly for careful consideration. The Separatists attack Geonosis, trying to kill dozens of Jedi in the arena. The Republic is threatened with immediate war, and there, ready and waiting, is an army. The Jedi face a choice: use the clone army and save the Republic from conquest by the Separatists, or refuse on moral grounds and watch everything they've sworn to protect fall into chaos and violence. When framed like that, the choice seems obvious. Of course they use the army. Strategic necessity overrides other concerns. But that framing itself is part of the trap. Palpatine engineered the entire situation to present the Jedi with exactly this dilemma.
He created both the separatist threat and the clone army solution. He manufactured a crisis where the Jedi would feel they had no choice but to
compromise their principles. The Jedi should have been more suspicious. They should have questioned why an army appeared at the exact moment they needed one. They should have investigated the origins more thoroughly before deploying the clones in battle, but they didn't. And part of why they didn't was that they were already sliding down a slope of compromised principles. The Jedi Order in the prequel era had become deeply entangled with the Republic government. They served as advisors to the Chancellor, enforcers of Republic law, diplomats and negotiators. They'd become, in effect, a military religious order in service of the state. This wasn't necessarily by choice. The Republic relied on them, and the Jedi believed in the ideals the Republic supposedly stood for. But this entanglement meant the Jedi had lost some of their independence. They couldn't easily stand aside and let the Republic fall because they were part of the Republic's power structure. Their fate was tied to its survival. So when crisis came, when war seemed inevitable, they supported the Republic's military response, even though that response involved ethical compromises. Throughout the Clone Wars, we see individual Jedi grappling with this. Ahsoka Tano questions the Jedi's role in the war, eventually leaving the Order entirely. Barriss Offee becomes so disillusioned that she turns to terrorism, believing the Jedi have betrayed their principles. Even Yoda, near the end of the war, has visions that suggest he's deeply troubled by the path the Order has taken. But troubled or not, the Jedi continued to command clone troopers. They continued to send men into battle, knowing these men had no choice. And some Jedi were worse than others. Pong Krell, a Jedi general who fell to the dark side, treated clones with open contempt. He called them by their numbers, deliberately put them in danger, and saw their deaths as meaningless. He represented the worst-case scenario. What happened when you combined military authority with a willingness to see clones as less than human? The clones themselves noticed the variation in how Jedi treated them. Some Jedi, like Anakin and Obi-Wan and Plo Koon, learned names and showed respect. Others were more distant, treating the clones as competent but ultimately replaceable soldiers. This inconsistency must have been confusing and demoralizing. Your worth as a person depended on which Jedi you served under, whether they happened to see you as an individual or just as clone trooper number 7567. The relationship between Jedi and clones was fundamentally unequal. The Jedi were the authority figures, the generals making strategic decisions. The clones followed orders. Yes, experienced clones like Rex had input on tactics. Yes, friendships formed. But at the end of the day, the power dynamic was clear. The Jedi were free. The clones were not. There's a painful irony in the fact that the Jedi, who believed in the Force and in every living being's connection to it, failed so completely to advocate for the clones' freedom. The Force connected everyone, clone and Jedi and ordinary citizen alike. If the Jedi truly believed in the fundamental equality and worth of all life, they should have been the loudest voices demanding rights and freedom for the clones. But they weren't. At best, they treated their troops kindly within the existing system. At worst, they actively participated in a military hierarchy that dehumanized clone troopers. The Jedi's failure here wasn't a failure of individual character, so much as a systemic failure, a failure of institutions and priorities. The Jedi had become so focused on their role as guardians of the Republic that they lost sight of their deeper principles. They were warrior monks who'd forgotten the monk part, letting the warrior duties dominate. They served the Republic, ostensibly to protect people,
but ended up protecting an institution that created and enslaved millions. Count Dooku, ironically, makes this point in propaganda. In the novel Dark Disciple, he's shown giving a speech where he points out that the Republic has created countless living beings and sent them to their deaths, while the Separatists use mainly droids. It's presented as manipulative propaganda, and it is. Dooku doesn't actually care about the clones' welfare. But the point itself is valid. The Republic did create people specifically to die in war. That's horrifying, no matter how you frame it. Some fans argue that the Jedi had no good options, that they did the best they could in an impossible situation. And there's truth to that. Refusing to use the clone army wouldn't have freed the clones. It would just have left them under different, possibly worse, commanders. The Jedi at least tried to minimize casualties and treated their troops with some measure of respect. But doing the best you can in a bad situation doesn't absolve you of moral responsibility for participating in that situation. The Jedi could have done more. They could have publicly advocated for clone rights. They could have pushed for legislation granting clones citizenship and the right to leave military service after the war. They could have made clone welfare a political issue, using their influence to change the system rather than just trying to be kind within it. They didn't do these things, probably because they were too focused on winning the war, too worried that rocking the boat would weaken the Republic at a critical time. But that priority, winning the war over advocating for basic rights, was itself a moral failing. It meant accepting that some people's freedom mattered less than military victory. The ultimate tragedy is that the Jedi's compromise accomplished nothing. They used the clone army to fight the Separatists, believing they were defending the Republic. But the whole war was a sham, engineered by Palpatine to destroy the Jedi. And when Order 66 came, when the inhibitor chips activated and the clones turned on
Their generals, all those bonds and friendships and moments of kindness meant nothing. The Jedi died at the hands of the slave army they'd commanded. The clones, stripped of free will by the chips in their brains, murdered people they'd fought beside for years. It was the darkest possible outcome. A betrayal that was also not really a betrayal because the clones had no choice. They were programmed to obey. And when the order came, they obeyed. The inhibitor chip controversy. Perhaps no single element of Clone Wars lore has been more debated among fans than the inhibitor chips. These organic control devices, implanted in every clone's brain during embryonic development, fundamentally changed the nature of Order 66 and raised new ethical questions on top of the ones already present. Originally, in the broader Legends continuity, Order 66 was simply an order. The clones were trained and conditioned to follow certain contingency protocols, and Order 66 was one of them. When given the command, the clones would execute their Jedi commanders, viewing them as traitors to the Republic. It was chilling specifically because the clones made a choice, however influenced by conditioning and loyalty to command structures. Some Legends material explored this further, showing clones who struggled with the Order, who felt conflicted about killing Jedi they'd served alongside. Commander Cody, after shooting down Obi-Wan Kenobi, supposedly struggled with guilt. The clones were following orders, doing their duty as they understood it. But they weren't mindless. They were aware of what they were doing, and at least some of them suffered for it. The Clone Wars animated series changed this.
In Season 6, we discover that Sith Lord Count Dooku provided the Kaminoans with inhibitor chips, presenting them as a safeguard against rogue Jedi who might give clones dangerous orders. In reality, these chips were designed to ensure absolute obedience when Order 66 was issued, overriding the clones' free will entirely. Clone Trooper Tup's chip malfunctioned during a battle, causing him to execute Jedi Master Tiplar before the order was officially given. This led to an investigation where Fives, another clone trooper, discovered the truth about the chips. He learned that every clone had one, that they were designed to control behavior, that the entire clone army was walking around with time bombs in their heads, ready to make them kill the Jedi. Fives tried to warn people. He went to the highest levels, even confronting Palpatine himself. But Palpatine, being the mastermind behind everything, manipulated the situation. He revealed his Sith identity to Fives, knowing no one would believe the clone trooper. Fives was then killed by other clones before he could prove anything, though he did manage to tell Captain Rex and others about his discoveries. Rex filed a report, but it went nowhere. The Jedi Council either never saw it or didn't investigate thoroughly. The warning was there.
The evidence existed, but the machinery of war kept grinding forward. And when Order 66 finally came, the chips activated. Clones across the galaxy suddenly turned on their Jedi commanders, unable to resist the programming in their brains. This change, making Order 66 the result of mind control rather than just following orders, has been controversial among fans. Some argue it diminishes the impact of the scene, making it less about the tragedy of good soldiers doing terrible things and more about helpless victims being forced to kill against their will. It removes moral complexity, turning Order 66 into straightforward mind control rather than a choice, however constrained by conditioning. Others argue the chips make more narrative sense. The Clone Wars showed such deep bonds between Jedi and clones that it strained credibility to think Captain Rex would just execute Ahsoka Tano on command, or that Commander Cody would casually shoot Obi-Wan. These relationships were too strong, the loyalty too genuine. Without something like the chips, Order 66 wouldn't work. Too many clones would refuse or hesitate, and the plan would fail. From an ethical standpoint, the inhibitor chips add another layer of horror to the clone situation. It wasn't enough that the clones were enslaved, genetically modified, and forced to fight. They also had control devices implanted in their brains, ready to hijack their agency entirely at a moment's notice. They were never free, not even in their own minds. The chips mean that every moment of friendship between Jedi and clones, every shared battle and expression of mutual respect, was built on a lie. The clones weren't choosing to serve. They couldn't choose otherwise. Even the ones who seemed most devoted, who appeared to genuinely care about their Jedi generals, were only one code phrase away from becoming executioners. It also means the clones weren't responsible for Order 66, which is both a relief and another tragedy. A relief because it means characters like Rex and Cody didn't actually betray Ahsoka and Obi-Wan. They were victims too, their bodies used as weapons against their will. But it's also tragic because it means they never even had the option to refuse. The one moment where you might say they could have made a choice, they couldn't. The chips took even that from them. Captain Rex's experience during Order 66, shown in the Clone Wars series finale, perfectly captures this horror. When Palpatine issues the order, Rex hears it and resists for just a few seconds. He manages to tell Ahsoka to find Fives' information before the chip takes over completely. It's agonizing to watch, seeing him struggle against programming in his own brain, briefly aware of what's happening, before he loses control entirely. Ahsoka has to stun Rex and physically remove his chip while surrounded by attacking clones. Once it's out, Rex is himself again, horrified by what he was about to do. He and Ahsoka then have to fight through corridors filled with clones Rex knows, brothers who would normally help him, but who are now trying to kill them both. It's one of the most powerful sequences in all of Star Wars, showing the full tragedy of what the inhibitor chips meant. Some clones never had their chips removed. They went through Order 66 still under its influence, and in the immediate aftermath, they were different. The Bad Batch shows this clearly. Clones who'd been friendly and individual became more aggressive, more uniform in behavior. They lost the personality quirks and customization that had defined them during the Clone Wars. They were more obedient, more like the Kaminoans had originally intended them to be. This raises a disturbing question. Were the chips constantly influencing the clones' behavior? Or did they only activate for Order 66? The show suggests both might be true. The chips limited independence and aggression generally, but the Order 66 protocol was a specific, powerful override. Either way, it means the clones were never operating with fully free will. Even before Order 66, even in their best moments, the chips were there, subtly shaping their choices. A few clones managed to have their chips removed before Order 66. Rex did after his experience with Ahsoka. Gregor and Wolf, two other named clones, also got theirs removed at some point. Clone Force 99, the Bad Batch, were naturally immune because their genetic mutations affected how the chips functioned. These clones became some of the only free clone troopers in the galaxy, able to make genuine choices about their loyalties and actions. The chips also raise questions about culpability and justice. After Order 66, clones who killed Jedi weren't tried as war criminals. They couldn't be, because they weren't in control of their actions. But that means there was never any accountability, never any recognition of what had been done to the Jedi. The clones were victims, but so were the Jedi they killed, and there was no framework for addressing both of those truths simultaneously. In the Bad Batch, we see how clone troopers transitioned from serving the Republic to serving the Empire. For most of them, nothing changed. They followed orders before Order 66 and they followed orders after. The chips ensured continuity of service. They were useful to the Emperor, so they remained soldiers, now enforcing Imperial rule instead of defending the Republic. But the Empire eventually phased out the clones, replacing them with recruited and conscripted stormtroopers. The official explanation was that clones were too expensive and took too long to mature. But there might have been another reason. Clones with their chips active were extremely obedient, but they also had a limited lifespan due to accelerated aging. They weren't a sustainable long-term solution. More importantly, natural-born soldiers could be indoctrinated through propaganda and training.
giving the Empire control without the ethical complications of
brain chips and genetic engineering. It's darkly ironic that the Empire moved toward a marginally more ethical military system simply because it was more practical, not because anyone cared about the rights of the soldiers involved. The inhibitor chips represent control at the most invasive level possible. They weren't just training or conditioning or even genetic modification. They were direct technological intervention in brain function, the ability to override consciousness and force behavior. In many ways, this is worse than traditional slavery. A slave in chains retains ownership of their own thoughts. The clones didn't even have that. And yet, despite the chips, despite the programming and the accelerated aging and all the other horrors of their existence, the clones still developed individuality. They still formed genuine relationships, still made meaningful choices in the spaces where they had agency. The human spirit, it seems, is harder to suppress than the Kaminoans anticipated. But that resilience makes their situation even more tragic, because it means they were aware enough to understand what had been done to them, even if they couldn't escape it. Life as property. To truly understand what the clone army represented ethically, we need to look at what life was actually like for an individual clone trooper. From creation to death, their existence was defined by their status as property, as tools created for a specific purpose. A clone's life began in a growth chamber on Kamino, one of millions of identical embryos developing in artificial wombs. They had no parents in any meaningful sense. Jango Fett was their genetic source, but he had no relationship with them beyond providing DNA. The Kaminoans oversaw their development with clinical detachment. There was no love, no nurturing, no sense that these beings mattered beyond their function. As they grew, accelerated beyond natural human development, they moved through stages of training. Young clones, children really, despite their advanced physical development, were organized into squads and put through combat simulations. Everything they learned was military-focused: weapons handling, tactics, vehicle operation, survival skills. There was no art, no literature, no philosophy. They weren't being educated to be complete people. They were being programmed to be soldiers. The Kaminoans monitored everything, watching for defects or deviations from the standard. Clones who couldn't meet physical requirements, who showed too much independence, or who had other issues were labeled as defective. In some cases, these defective clones were eliminated. In others, they were reassigned to support roles or maintenance work. Clone 99, who we meet in the Clone Wars, was one such case. He had physical deformities that made him unsuitable for combat, so he worked as a maintenance worker, helping younger clones and doing tasks around Kamino. Clone 99's existence highlights another ethical problem. Even among the clones, there was a hierarchy. Combat clones were the most valued. Support personnel, medics, pilots, they had their place but were still secondary. And defective clones, those who couldn't even fill support roles effectively, were at the bottom. Their lives were spared, sometimes, but they were constant reminders that they existed as products with quality standards. Failing to meet those standards meant being discarded. For clones who made it through training and were deployed to active service, life became an endless cycle of combat, brief rest, and more combat. They were stationed on Star Destroyers or at Republic bases, moved from battle to battle as the war demanded. They had barracks to sleep in, mess halls for eating, and training facilities for maintaining skills. But they had no personal space, no privacy, no time or resources for pursuing individual interests.
Everything a clone owned was Republic property, issued for specific purposes. Their armor, their weapons, their equipment. Even the few personal items some clones managed to acquire weren't really theirs. They could be confiscated or left behind without recourse. The armor customization we see in the Clone Wars, clones painting their helmets and adding personal touches, was technically against regulations. It was tolerated because it helped with morale and unit cohesion, but it wasn't a right. It was a privilege that could be revoked. Clones received no payment for their service. They didn't need money. The Republic provided everything they required to function as soldiers: food, shelter, medical care, equipment. But this also meant they had no economic independence, no ability to save up resources for a different life. Even if a clone wanted to desert, wanted to try living as Cut LaQuaine did, they'd have nothing. No credits, no civilian clothes, no identification that wasn't military. Their entire existence was bound up in being soldiers. The medical care clones received was focused entirely on maintaining combat effectiveness. Injuries were treated so soldiers could return to duty. Augmentations and enhancements were provided when they improved performance. But there was no consideration for long-term health or quality of life. The accelerated aging meant clones would be physically elderly by their mid-20s in chronological terms. There was no plan for what would happen to them after they were too old to fight effectively. In the Clone Wars, we see clones die constantly. They're shot by battle droids, caught in explosions, killed by enemy soldiers. Each death is noted by the Jedi and other clones, mourned briefly, and then the survivors move on to the next battle. There are no funerals for most clone troopers, no markers or memorials. Their names might be remembered by their brothers, but there's no broader recognition of their sacrifice. This casual expendability is built into the system. The Republic ordered millions of clones specifically because they expected
Massive casualties. These weren't soldiers being sent to fight with the hope they'd survive. These were soldiers created with the assumption that large numbers would die. Their deaths were factored into strategic planning from the beginning. A certain percentage of losses was acceptable, expected, built into the calculations. Clone commanders and specialized troops like ARCs or clone commandos had slightly better treatment. They were more valuable due to their training and experience, so more effort went into keeping them alive. They might have more autonomy in how they completed missions, though still within strict parameters. But even they were ultimately property, tools that happened to be more expensive and harder to replace than standard troopers. The social structure among clones was interesting because it emerged organically, despite the system's attempt to make them uniform. Clones formed tight bonds with their squad mates, viewing each other as brothers in the most literal sense. They developed squad cultures, nicknames, traditions. The Domino Squad, Bad Batch, and countless other units had distinct identities even though they were supposed to be interchangeable. These bonds were probably the only thing that made their existence bearable. Knowing you weren't alone, that your brothers understood what you were going through because they were going through it too. They shared the experience of being property, of having no control over their lives, of facing death constantly with no real choice in the matter. That shared suffering created connection. But these relationships also made things harder. Every battle meant potentially losing brothers, watching friends die, carrying on with diminished numbers. The clones experienced grief and loss repeatedly, continuously, for their entire short lives, and they couldn't escape it. They couldn't quit, couldn't step away to process trauma. They just had to keep fighting. Some Jedi recognized this and tried to help. Anakin Skywalker, having been born into slavery himself, seemed particularly attuned to the clones' situation. He didn't have the power to free them, but he treated them as people, valued their input, mourned their losses genuinely. Other Jedi, like Shaak Ti, advocated within the system for better treatment of clones during training and deployment. But these efforts, while appreciated by individual clones, didn't change the fundamental reality. The clones remained property. They remained enslaved. All the kindness in the galaxy couldn't change that basic fact. The psychological impact of this existence is hard to fully grasp. Imagine knowing from your earliest awareness that you were created to fight and die. Imagine having no choice about any aspect of your life, no possibility of a different future. Imagine watching your brothers die constantly, knowing you'll probably die the same way, and being unable to do anything about it. That's psychological torture on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Some clones broke under the strain. We see this occasionally in the Clone Wars. Clone troopers who crack under pressure, who make catastrophic mistakes, who seem to shut down emotionally. The Umbara arc shows clone troopers executing a friendly fire incident because they're following orders from Jedi General Pong Krell, who's secretly trying to make them kill each other. The psychological manipulation works because the clones are trained to follow orders, conditioned to obey even when their instincts might tell them something's wrong. After Order 66, life changed for the clones, but didn't necessarily improve. Those serving the Empire continued doing essentially what they'd always done, just with different enemies and objectives. But they started to be phased out, replaced by recruited troopers. The Empire didn't need them anymore, didn't want the complications of cloning and accelerated aging, when conventional recruitment could provide soldiers. What happened to clones who aged out of service or were injured too severely to fight? We don't have clear answers for most of them. Some, like Cut LaQuaine, managed to escape and build lives on remote planets. Others, like Captain Rex and Commander Gregor and Wolf, continued as mercenaries or freedom fighters after the Empire discarded them. But for the vast majority, their fate remains unknown. Given the Empire's general disregard for life and the clones' status as property, it's hard to be optimistic. There were no retirement benefits, no veteran support systems. The clones who'd fought to defend the Republic were simply disposed of when they were no longer useful. After giving everything, quite literally their entire existence, they were abandoned. In Rebels, we meet Rex, Wolf, and Gregor living in a modified AT-TE walker on a remote planet. They're old, showing the effects of accelerated aging, fighting in a war that ended years ago. Rex is physically around 60, having been created roughly 30 years before the events of Rebels. He's elderly by clone standards, but still capable of fighting when needed. These three represent the lucky ones, clones who survived long enough to gain some measure of freedom. But they're also tragic figures.
Old soldiers living in isolation, their service forgotten by the galaxy they helped save. They have freedom now, but only because no one wants them anymore. Their obsolete equipment that happened to remain functional past its expected lifespan. The Republic's moral failure. The clone army wasn't just a Jedi problem or a Kaminoan creation. It was fundamentally a failure of the Galactic Republic itself. A demonstration of how a democracy could compromise its values when faced with crisis. The Republic, in its ideals, stood for freedom, justice, and the rights of sentient beings. It had laws against slavery. It claimed to value life and liberty. But when presented with an army of enslaved soldiers, the Senate approved their use without serious debate about the ethical implications. The sheer convenience of having ready-made soldiers overrode any moral concerns. This wasn't an oversight or an accident. The Senate explicitly voted to create a Grand Army of the Republic, knowing full well what that army consisted of. They approved funding for continued clone production. They passed legislation organizing the clones into a military structure. At every step, they had opportunities to address the ethical problems. And at every step, they chose not to. Some senators must have objected. The Republic contained thousands of member worlds with diverse cultures and philosophies. Surely some civilizations would have found the idea of a slave army abhorrent. But we see no evidence of serious opposition. No major political movement advocating for clone rights. The closest we get is occasional mentions of anti-war sentiment. People who opposed the Clone Wars generally, but not specifically because of concerns about the clones. This suggests a broader moral failure, a willingness to ignore ethical problems when they're inconvenient. The Republic citizenry benefited enormously from the clone army. They didn't have to fight, didn't have to send their children to war, didn't have to sacrifice anything personally. The clones bore all the burden. And because the clones weren't citizens, weren't voters, weren't politically connected, they had no power to demand better treatment. This is how slavery tends to work. It persists not because of universal support, but because the people with power benefit from it, and the enslaved have no power to change the system. The Republic's slavery of the clones was, if anything, more complete than historical slavery systems, because the clones literally had no existence outside of slavery. They couldn't escape to freedom because they'd never been free. The economic aspect is worth examining too. Creating the clone army was extraordinarily expensive. The Republic took out massive loans to finance it, leading to significant debt. This debt became a plot point, with concerns about the economic sustainability of the war effort. But no one seriously suggested that one way to reduce costs would be to stop creating enslaved soldiers and instead develop a volunteer military or implement conscription. The expense was acceptable because it preserved the status quo for Republic citizens. They could maintain their comfortable lives while someone else fought the war. The debt was a collective burden, spread across the entire Republic through taxes and economic policies. But the real burden?
The burden of actually fighting and dying fell entirely on beings who had no say in any of it. There's also the question of what the Republic intended to do with the clones after the war. This doesn't seem to have been seriously considered. The war was expected to be relatively short, but even so, you'd think someone would ask what happens to 3 million or more clone soldiers once peace is achieved. The most optimistic possibility would be granting them citizenship and freedom, allowing them to integrate into Republic society, but there's no evidence this was ever planned. The more likely scenario, given what we see in the transition to the Empire, is that the clones would have remained military assets kept on active duty or in reserve for future conflicts. Some might argue that the Republic didn't have time to debate ethics, that the separatist threat was too immediate, but that argument falls apart when you look at the timeline. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. That's 3 years during which the Senate could have passed legislation granting clones basic rights. 3 years during which advocacy groups could have formed, pushing for reform. 3 years during which the ethical problems could have been addressed. Instead, the Republic doubled down. They ordered more clones, built more facilities, expanded the military-industrial complex around clone production. They became increasingly dependent on their slave army, making the ethical problems harder to solve because solving them would mean dismantling the military structure that was supposedly defending democracy. This is how moral compromises tend to work. You make one small compromise, telling yourself it's temporary, that you'll fix it later, that circumstances force your hand. But that compromise enables other compromises, creates systems and structures that have their own momentum. Eventually, you're so invested in the compromised system that unwinding it seems impossible. The Republic fell into this trap completely. They accepted the clone army as a temporary measure during crisis. But crisis became the new normal, and the temporary measure became permanent. By the time anyone might have questioned whether enslaving millions of people was worth it, the answer didn't matter anymore. The system was entrenched, and the political will to change it didn't exist. Senator Padme Amidala serves as an interesting case study. She was generally portrayed as one of the more principled senators, someone who opposed violence and valued life. But even she doesn't seem to have made clone rights a major issue. She opposed the war generally, advocated for diplomatic solutions, but we don't see her specifically fighting for the clones' freedom or rights. This might seem unfair to single out Padme, but it illustrates how even well-meaning people can fail to address obvious ethical problems when those problems are systemic. Padme was busy with other issues, other causes, other political battles. The clones' situation was just one problem among many, and not one that affected her constituents directly. So it fell by the wayside, never becoming a priority. The broader population of the Republic seemed largely indifferent to the clones. In the Clone Wars, when we see civilian populations, they generally view clone troopers as soldiers doing their duty. There's appreciation for their service, sometimes sympathy for their casualties, but no widespread recognition that these soldiers are enslaved people deserving freedom. This indifference is, in some ways, more damning than active cruelty. The Kaminoans created the clones and viewed them as products, which is terrible but at least coherent with their perspective. The Republic citizenry benefited from the clones' service, while simultaneously ignoring their personhood.
They wanted the protection, but didn't want to think about what it cost or who was paying. Historical parallels are uncomfortable but unavoidable. Many societies have benefited from slavery or exploitation, while the broader population remained willfully ignorant of the conditions that made their comfort possible. People don't want to examine the systems that benefit them too closely, because doing so might require sacrifice or change. The Republic's failure regarding the clone army was ultimately a failure of courage. It would have taken courage to reject the easy solution, to refuse the convenient army, and instead make the harder choices that real defense would require. It would have taken courage to grant the clones freedom and rights, accepting the complications that would follow. It would have taken courage to admit that using enslaved soldiers was wrong, even if strategically necessary. That courage didn't exist at the institutional level. Individual Jedi showed it. Individual clones certainly showed it. But the Senate, the Chancellor's office, the various bureaucracies and military structures, they all failed. They chose convenience over principle, immediate security over long-term justice. And in the end, this moral failure didn't even achieve its goal. The Republic fell anyway. The clone army, created to defend democracy, became the instrument of its destruction. The clones, enslaved to protect freedom, ended up enforcing tyranny. Every compromise, every ethical shortcut, every decision to prioritize expedience over principle led to catastrophe. This is one of the most sophisticated elements of the prequel story. The Republic didn't fall because it was invaded by overwhelming evil. It fell because it compromised its values, because it accepted solutions that contradicted its principles, because it chose to preserve the appearance of democracy while undermining its substance. The clone army was both symptom and accelerant of this decay. Real-world parallels and modern questions. While Star Wars is fiction, the ethical questions raised by the clone army connect to very real issues we face or will face in the near future. The intersection of biotechnology, military necessity, and human rights creates dilemmas that aren't confined to galaxies far, far away. The most obvious parallel is human cloning itself. As of now, human reproductive cloning is illegal in most countries and considered deeply unethical by most bioethicists. The reasons mirror many of the concerns raised by the clone army story. Creating human beings for specific purposes, denying them autonomous existence, treating people as means rather than ends. But therapeutic cloning, the creation of cloned cells or tissues for medical purposes, is less clearly unethical. If we can clone organs to save lives, should we? What about cloning specific cell types to study diseases? The line between acceptable and unacceptable uses of cloning technology isn't always clear. And the Star Wars scenario, extreme as it is, helps us think through where we want those lines to be. The accelerated aging aspect raises questions about human enhancement and modification generally. We already have the ability to modify human embryos genetically, though doing so is highly controversial and restricted. The more we learn about genetics, the more capability we'll have to design humans with specific traits. The Kaminoans modified the clones for docility and accelerated growth. In our world, future geneticists might be asked to modify embryos for intelligence, strength, or other desirable characteristics. Where's the ethical line? If we can prevent genetic diseases through modification, that seems good. If we can enhance capabilities beyond normal human range, that becomes more questionable. If we create people who are fundamentally altered to serve specific purposes, we've crossed into deeply problematic territory. The clone army represents the extreme end of this spectrum, showing us what happens when human genetic engineering is pursued with no ethical constraints. The question of autonomy and consent is central here. The clones couldn't consent to their creation or their modifications. They were made decisions about before they existed, designed by others for others' purposes. This is true of all children to some degree. But there's a difference between parents making choices for a child's welfare and engineers designing a product to meet specifications. As genetic engineering technology advances, we'll face questions about how much modification is acceptable, who gets to decide, and what rights genetically modified people have. The clone army story suggests we need to be very careful about creating people with built-in limitations or purposes, because doing so denies them the open future that ethical personhood requires. The military ethics angle is equally relevant. Modern militaries face constant questions about recruitment, conscription, and the use of various technologies in warfare. The clone army represents extreme solution to military manpower problems, but it's not as far-fetched as we might like to think. Private military companies already exist, organizations that provide soldiers for hire. These aren't enslaved clones, but they do represent the outsourcing of military functions to entities outside traditional national military structures. Questions arise about accountability, about whether these soldiers have the same protections as national military members, about who they're really serving. Autonomous weapons systems, drones and robots capable of making targeting decisions without human intervention raise similar questions to those posed by the clone army. If we create artificial intelligence capable of fighting wars for us, what responsibilities do we have toward those AI systems? If they're sophisticated enough to be considered sentient or conscious, does using them in warfare become unethical? The clone army and autonomous weapons both represent attempts to wage war without putting traditional soldiers at risk. Both involve creating or manufacturing entities specifically for combat. The main difference is that clones are biological and clearly conscious, while current AI systems aren't. But as AI advances, that distinction might blur. We could end up creating digital clones, artificial minds designed to fight and die, so humans don't have to. The inhibitor chip concept connects to modern concerns about neural technology and brain-computer interfaces. We're developing technology that can interface directly with the human brain, potentially allowing for enhanced capabilities or medical treatments. But this same technology could theoretically be used for control or manipulation, inserting commands or altering behavior at the neural level. The chips in the clones' brains represent the darkest possible use of such technology, complete override of individual will. While we're far from that capability now, the ethical questions need to be addressed before the technology exists. What safeguards are necessary? What uses should be absolutely prohibited? How do we prevent the abuse of neural interface technology while allowing beneficial applications?
There's also a parallel in the discussion of designer babies and genetic selection. Some people argue that parents should be able to choose traits for their children, selecting for intelligence, health, physical capabilities, or other desirable characteristics. Others argue this turns children into projects, denying them autonomy and treating them as products to be optimized. The clone army shows the logical extreme of this approach. The Kaminoans didn't just select for desirable traits. They engineered entire human beings to specification, removing undesirable qualities and enhancing others. The clones weren't children being given advantages by parents who loved them. They were products being manufactured to meet client requirements. That's the nightmare scenario that opponents of genetic selection worry about. Questions of personhood and rights become complicated when we consider non-traditional forms of consciousness or existence. If we create artificial intelligence that appears conscious, does it have rights? If we develop brain-computer interfaces that allow human consciousness to be copied or transferred, do those copies have the same rights as the original? If we genetically engineer humans with significant modifications, are they still fully human with all attendant rights? The Republic's treatment of clones as property rather than citizens shows how easy it is to deny personhood when it's convenient. The clones looked human, acted human, thought and felt in human ways, but because they were created rather than born, they were classified as property. This is a warning about how we might treat future forms of consciousness or modified humans. The criteria we use to determine personhood matters enormously. There are also parallels in how societies treat marginalized groups generally. The Republic citizenry's indifference to the clone's suffering mirrors how privileged populations often ignore or rationalize the exploitation of less powerful groups. Whether it's sweatshop labor, human trafficking, or exploitative working conditions, there's a pattern of people benefiting from systems they'd rather not examine too closely. The clone army makes this dynamic explicit and impossible to ignore. The Republic citizens were directly benefiting from enslaved soldiers fighting on their behalf, but similar dynamics exist in less obvious forms throughout our world. Understanding the clone army's ethics might help us recognize and address exploitation in our own societies. From a philosophical standpoint, the clone army raises questions about the social contract and political obligation. In most democratic theories, citizens have obligations to their society, including potentially military service, because they benefit from that society's protections and participate in its governance. But the clones had no such reciprocal relationship. They received no benefits beyond bare survival, had no political participation, and couldn't choose to leave. This makes their obligation to fight completely one-sided. They owed the Republic nothing, having never consented to membership in it, yet they were forced to die defending it. This is political philosophy's nightmare scenario. Obligation without consent, duty without rights, sacrifice without recognition. Modern debates about military service and conscription connect here. Is it ethical for a government to compel military service? If so, Under what conditions? What rights do conscripts have? How is military service different from slavery if people are forced into it? These questions don't have easy answers, but the clone army helps illuminate what's at stake. The role of technology in warfare and society more broadly is another parallel. The clones represent technology being used to solve a social problem. The Republic needed soldiers, and biotechnology provided them. But this technological solution created new problems worse than the original one. It's a cautionary tale about reaching for technological fixes without considering broader implications. We see this pattern in many modern contexts. Social media was supposed to connect people and spread information. Instead, it's created problems of privacy, mental health, and political polarization. Automated systems were supposed to make decision-making more efficient and objective. Instead, they've sometimes amplified bias and reduced accountability. The clone army fits this pattern perfectly. A technological solution that seemed convenient but turned out catastrophic. The aftermath and legacy. After Order 66, after the Republic became the Empire, what happened to the clones became even more tragic. They'd fought for 3 years defending democracy, forming bonds with Jedi generals, believing they were serving a just cause. Then, in a single moment, everything changed. They were forced to kill their commanders, to betray people they'd fought alongside, to become instruments of the very tyranny they thought they were preventing. And then the Empire didn't even want them anymore. As mentioned earlier, the transition to recruited stormtroopers happened relatively quickly. By the time of Rebels, about 15 years after Order 66, most Imperial stormtroopers were natural-born humans who'd enlisted or been conscripted. The clones were being phased out, discarded like obsolete equipment. Those clones who remained in service found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They'd been created to defend the Republic, and now they were enforcing Imperial rule. Some, like Commander Cody, who appears in some expanded universe material, struggled with this transition. Others simply continued following orders as they'd been programmed to do, unable to see any alternative. The accelerated aging meant that clones were hitting their physical limits earlier than natural humans. A clone who'd been 20 years old biologically at the end of the Clone Wars would be physically 40 by the time of Rebels, and 40 for a clone might mean elderly. Their useful service life was short, and the Empire had no interest in supporting them afterward. Cut Lawquane's story becomes even more poignant in this context. He'd already deserted during the Clone Wars, building a life as a farmer with his wife and stepchildren. In the Bad Batch, we see him again after Order 66, now living on a different planet, still trying to stay hidden. The Empire is hunting down clone deserters, viewing them as security risks. Cut has to flee again, taking his family and trying to find safety in a galaxy that's become even more dangerous. Cut represents what the clones could have been if they'd been given freedom. He's a good person, a loving father and husband, a productive member of his community. But he had to abandon military service and live in hiding to achieve this. The fact that such a normal, peaceful life required desertion and exile shows how completely the clones were denied basic freedom. Captain Rex's arc through the Clone Wars, Rebels, and mention in later material shows another path. Rex removed his inhibitor chip and fought against the Empire, joining the early rebellion. In Rebels, he and his brothers Wolf and Gregor help the Ghost Crew, eventually joining the larger Rebel Alliance. Rex actually survives to the Battle of Endor, appearing briefly in Return of the Jedi's updated special edition, fighting to destroy the second Death Star. Rex is a survivor, but his survival comes at a cost. He's seen countless brothers die. He's fought in a war that accomplished nothing good, serving masters who viewed him as property. He's old, worn out by accelerated aging and decades of combat. His freedom came only because he was useful to a new cause, and even then, he's still fighting. He's never known peace, never had the chance to just live without warfare defining his existence. The Bad Batch itself focuses on Clone Force 99, a group of clones with genetic mutations that make them different from standard troopers. Their mutations also affect how their inhibitor chips function, giving them more resistance to Order 66, most of them anyway. Crosshair, whose mutation enhances his targeting skills, remains under his chip's influence longer, creating conflict within the squad. The Bad Batch escapes Imperial service and becomes mercenaries, taking jobs and trying to find their place in the post-war galaxy. They're hunted by the Empire, viewed as defective clones who represent a security risk. Along the way, they discover Omega, a female clone who's genetically unaltered, and protect her from the Empire's attempts to capture her for genetic research. The show explores what happens to clones when they're no longer needed for their original purpose. Some, like Captain Hauser, begin questioning their orders and eventually defect. Others, like the clone troopers who serve as trainers for the new Stormtrooper program, remain loyal to the Empire even as they're being replaced. The clones are scattered, struggling to find purpose and survival in a galaxy that used them and discarded them. There's a particularly moving scene in The Bad Batch where the squad encounters a group of clones who've been decommissioned, living on a remote planet. These clones are old, showing the effects of accelerated aging, with nowhere to go and nothing to do. They served the Republic faithfully, survived the Clone Wars, and now they're just waiting to die because nobody needs them anymore. This is the legacy of the Clone Army. Millions of people created for a specific purpose, used until they weren't useful anymore, then abandoned. Those who died in battle at least died serving the cause they believed in, however misguided that service was. Those who survived had to live with the knowledge that their entire existence had been a manipulation, that they'd been tools in Palpatine's grand plan to destroy the Jedi and establish his empire. The trauma this must have caused is difficult to imagine. The clones who removed their inhibitor chips or whose chips malfunctioned before Order 66 had to live with the knowledge of what they almost did, or what their brothers did. Rex knew he'd nearly killed Ahsoka, the person he'd fought beside for years, someone he considered a friend. That burden never goes away. For clones who remained under their chip's influence through Order 66, the experience might have been even worse. They killed their Jedi commanders, then later, as the chip's effects diminished, had to process what they'd done. Some might have rationalized it as following orders, as doing their duty. Others might have been destroyed by guilt. We don't have many stories about this, but the psychological impact would have been catastrophic. The broader galactic legacy is complicated too. The clone army proved that you could create living beings for slavery, use them for warfare, and face minimal consequences. The ethical boundaries that should have prevented such a thing turned out to be weak when tested by crisis and convenience. That's a troubling precedent, suggesting that even seemingly civilized societies will commit atrocities if the circumstances seem to justify it. The Empire's transition to recruited stormtroopers rather than clones might seem like progress, but it's minimal at best. Recruited soldiers at least chose to serve in some sense, though Imperial recruitment involved heavy propaganda, and many stormtroopers were conscripts who had limited choice. It's marginally better than slavery, but only marginally. And the fact remains that the Empire was built on the foundation the Republic laid with the clone army. Palpatine couldn't have executed Order 66 without the clones. He couldn't have transformed the Republic into an empire without a loyal military force already in place. The clone army was the instrument of democracy's death, turned against the Jedi who'd commanded them and the system they'd supposedly defended. In-universe, there doesn't seem to be much collective memory or guilt about the clone army. The New Republic, formed after the Empire's fall, doesn't appear to have made any special provisions for surviving clones or any monuments to their sacrifice. They're just footnotes in history, their suffering forgotten by everyone except those who lived through it. This mirrors how real-world historical injustices are often minimized or forgotten. The systems that benefit from exploitation rarely want to remember or acknowledge that exploitation afterward. It's easier to move on, to focus on the future rather than reckoning with past wrongs. But that forgetting means the lessons aren't learned, the patterns aren't recognized, and similar injustices become possible again. Conclusion: the uncomfortable truth. We've journeyed deep into the ethical nightmare that was the clone army, examining it from multiple angles. The creation of millions of enslaved soldiers, the Jedi's moral compromise in leading them, the Republic's failure to address obvious injustice, the inhibitor chips that made slaves of their own minds, the aftermath that saw these soldiers discarded after their usefulness ended. Throughout all of this, one truth remains uncomfortable and inescapable. The heroes of Star Wars, the Jedi Order that we're supposed to admire, the Galactic Republic that represents democracy and freedom, they participated in one of the most comprehensive systems of slavery and exploitation imaginable. They created people specifically to die in war, denied them any choice or freedom, and then used them until they broke. This isn't a flaw in the storytelling. It's the point. George Lucas and the writers who expanded on the prequel era were showing us how democracies fall, how good people participate in evil systems, how moral compromises accumulate until you've lost everything you thought you stood for. The clone army is effective as storytelling precisely because it makes us uncomfortable. We want to root for the Jedi.
We want to see the Republic as the good guys fighting against separatist aggression. But the clone army forces us to confront the fact that the good guys in this story are deeply compromised, that they're participating in something fundamentally wrong. And that's true to life. Real-world history is full of societies that claim to value freedom while enslaving people. Democracies that spoke of human rights while denying them to specific groups. Leaders who genuinely believed they were doing good while perpetuating evil systems. The Clone Army story works because it reflects these real patterns, showing us, in science fiction form, what happens when principles collide with perceived necessity. The clones themselves are the tragic center of all this. They're people who deserved freedom, autonomy, the right to determine their own lives. They deserved childhoods that weren't just military training. They deserved the chance to pursue interests and relationships and goals of their own choosing. They deserved to live normal lifespans, to grow old naturally, to exist as something other than soldiers. They never got any of that. From the moment of their creation to their eventual deaths or obsolescence, their lives were controlled by others. The Kaminoans designed them. The Republic owned them. The Jedi commanded them. Palpatine manipulated them. They were passed from hand to hand like property, never given a voice in their own fate. And yet, despite everything, the clones developed personalities. They formed bonds. They showed courage and creativity and all the qualities that make people admirable. They chose names for themselves. They decorated their armor. They told jokes and mourned losses and did everything they could to assert their humanity within a system designed to deny it. That resilience is both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring because it shows the human spirit's ability to persist even under the worst conditions. Heartbreaking because it reminds us that these were people who deserved so much better than they got. Every moment of individuality they managed to claim was a small victory against a system built to suppress it. But it was also a reminder of what they were being denied. The question of what we as an audience are supposed to take from all this remains complex.
One level, the Clone Army story is a tragedy, a demonstration of how crisis enables authoritarianism and how good intentions can pave roads to horror. We're meant to see the fall of the Republic as catastrophic, the transformation of the Jedi from peacekeepers to generals as corruption of their principles. But on another level, the story asks us to examine our own complicity in similar systems. Most of us benefit from exploitation somewhere in our supply chains, from labor practices we'd rather not examine too closely. Most of our societies have armed forces that raise questions about voluntariness, equality of opportunity, and who bears the burden of national defense. We're not using clone armies, not literally, but we are making choices about how much convenience we're willing to accept at what cost to others. We are participating in systems that treat some people as less valuable than others. We are, in small ways and sometimes large ones, doing what the Republic did, prioritizing our comfort and security over other people's freedom and dignity. The Clone Army forces us to confront these questions through the clarity of science fiction. When the exploitation is literal slavery of manufactured people, it's impossible to miss. That clarity should make us think about the less obvious forms of exploitation we encounter or participate in daily. There's also a question about redemption and change. Can systems that do terrible things reform themselves? The Republic clearly couldn't. It collapsed into the Empire, and even after the Empire fell, the New Republic doesn't seem to have done much to address the legacy of the clone army. But perhaps that's asking too much. Perhaps some wrongs are too fundamental to be repaired, only learned from. For individual characters, redemption arcs vary. Rex fought against the Empire, trying to make amends for his forced participation in Order 66. Other clones like Cut LaQuaine simply tried to live peaceful lives, refusing to participate in the system anymore. The Jedi Order was destroyed, making institutional redemption impossible. But individual Jedi survivors had to live with what they'd done. Ahsoka Tano's journey is particularly relevant here. She left the Jedi Order before Order 66, having become disillusioned with how the Jedi had changed during the war. When Order 66 came, when her friend Rex nearly killed her because of his inhibitor chip, she saw the full horror of what the Jedi had been participating in. She spent the rest of her life fighting against the Empire, trying to help people, but she never rejoined the Jedi Order. She couldn't go back to an institution that had so thoroughly compromised its values. That's perhaps the most honest response. Acknowledge what was done wrong. Work to prevent similar injustices, but don't pretend you can simply return to innocence. The Jedi's fall wasn't just Palpatine's manipulation. It was their own choices, their own compromises, their own failure to live up to their principles when it mattered most. The Clone Army story ultimately serves as a mirror, reflecting questions about ethics, power, and complicity that extend far beyond Star Wars. It asks what we're willing to accept in the name of security. It asks how we value different lives. It asks whether good intentions matter when outcomes are catastrophic. It asks whether any of us are as principled as we'd like to believe when tested by real crisis. These aren't comfortable questions. They don't have easy answers, but they're worth sitting with, worth thinking through, because the alternative is sleepwalking through moral decisions without recognizing their full weight. The clones deserved better. They deserved to be recognized as people from the start, to be given freedom and choice, to have their sacrifices honored rather than forgotten. The fact that they didn't get these things isn't just a failure of the Star Wars Republic. It's a warning about our own capacity for moral blindness, our own tendency to rationalize exploitation when it benefits us. Every clone trooper who died on the battlefield was a person with potential, with thoughts and feelings, with brothers who mourned them. Every clone who survived the war only to be discarded by the Empire deserved recognition for their service, support for their futures, acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The fact that most clones received none of this is an indictment of the society that used them, and we, as viewers, bear witness to that indictment. We see the clone troopers as people. We mourn when characters like Fives or Heavy or Waxer die. We celebrate when Rex and others find freedom. We recognize the injustice, even as the characters within the story often don't. That recognition matters because it means we can apply the lessons to our own world, our own choices, our own complicity in systems we know are wrong. The clone army will always be one of the most ethically complex elements of Star Wars. It adds depth and darkness to a story that could have been simple good versus evil. It challenges us to think critically about heroism, about justice, about what it really means to stand for freedom and democracy. And it reminds us that sometimes the greatest evils aren't committed by obvious villains, but by ordinary people making compromises they tell themselves are necessary. In the end, the clone troopers represent the price of those compromises. They were human beings sacrificed to expediency, their lives and freedom traded for strategic advantage. They deserved so much more than they received, and the galaxy they fought to defend should have done better by them. That it didn't says everything about the Republic's fall, the Jedi's failure, and the eternal human capacity to rationalize the unthinkable when it serves our purposes. It's a dark lesson, but an important one, and it's embedded in a story about space wizards and laser swords, proving that sometimes the most profound truths come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Final reflections and moving forward. As we close this exploration of the clone army's ethics, it's worth considering what this all means for how we engage with Star Wars and with fiction more broadly. These stories aren't just entertainment, though they certainly are that. They're also thought experiments, ways of exploring complex moral questions in contexts where the stakes are clear and the consequences visible. The clone army works as a narrative device precisely because it exaggerates real-world issues to the point where they become undeniable. Most exploitation isn't this obvious. Most moral compromises aren't this clear-cut. But by presenting us with an unambiguous case of people being created and enslaved for others' convenience, the story forces us to think about more subtle cases. When you start asking whether the clones are people deserving freedom, you're building ethical reasoning skills that apply elsewhere. When you examine how the Jedi rationalized their participation in the clone army's use, you're learning to recognize rationalization in other contexts. When you see how the Republic's citizens benefited from the clone's suffering while remaining ignorant of or indifferent to it, you're learning to examine similar dynamics in your own society. This is why science fiction matters. It creates spaces where we can explore dangerous or difficult ideas at a safe distance. then bring the insights back to our own world. The clone army isn't real, but the ethical questions it raises are. And by thinking through those questions in a fictional context, we prepare ourselves to face similar questions in reality. The Star Wars franchise has continued to develop the clone story even after the prequel trilogy ended. The Clone Wars animated series gave us years of stories focused on clone troopers as individuals, showing their personalities and struggles. The Bad Batch explores what happens to clones after they're no longer needed. These expansions have enriched the narrative, making the ethical dimensions even more apparent and difficult to ignore. Future Star Wars stories will likely continue exploring these themes. There are still clone survivors scattered across the galaxy during the sequel trilogy era. There are questions about how different groups view the clone army in retrospect, whether anyone has tried to document their stories or honor their sacrifices. There's potential for stories about clone descendants, if any clones manage to have families, about the generational trauma of being born from such a horrific system. But beyond Star Wars specifically, the Clone Army story has become a touchstone for discussions about military ethics, biotechnology, and human rights. It's referenced in debates about cloning, about autonomous weapons, about how militaries should be structured. It's become shorthand for certain ethical concerns, a shared cultural reference point that helps people communicate complex ideas. That cultural impact means the story has achieved something significant. It's not just entertaining or even just thought-provoking. It's actually influencing how people think about real-world issues, providing vocabulary and frameworks for ethical discussions that might otherwise be more difficult to have. For those of us who create content about these stories, who analyze and discuss them, there's a responsibility to do so thoughtfully. It would be easy to treat the Clone Army as just another cool element of Star Wars world building, focusing on their armor designs or battle tactics while ignoring the ethical horror of their existence. But doing so would miss the point entirely. The creators of these stories, at least in the modern Clone Wars era, were clearly trying to make us think about these issues. They weren't subtle about it. They showed us individual clones with personalities and dreams. They showed us the injustice of their situation. They invited us to care about these characters while simultaneously making clear that the system treating them as property was fundamentally wrong. Responding to that invitation, taking these ethical questions seriously, is part of engaging with the story as it was meant to be engaged with. It's respecting the work that the writers and creators put into crafting a narrative that functions on multiple levels, that works as action-adventure entertainment, but also as moral fable and cautionary tale. As viewers, as fans, as people who think about these stories, we have the opportunity to carry forward the lessons they offer. We can recognize exploitation when we see it, even in subtle forms. We can question systems that benefit us at others' expense. We can refuse to accept that necessity justifies any action, demanding instead that we find solutions consistent with our principles. These might seem like abstract goals removed from the concrete reality of daily life, but they're not. Every day we make choices about what we consume, what we support, what we're willing to tolerate in our society. Every day we decide how much we'll examine our own complicity in systems we know are flawed. Every day we choose whether to be convenient or principled when those two things conflict. The Clone Army story suggests that those choices matter enormously, that the small compromises accumulate into catastrophic failures, that good intentions mean nothing if they don't translate into good actions, that treating people as means rather than ends corrodes everything it touches, no matter how necessary or justified it seems at the time. These are hard lessons. They demand things from us that we might not want to give. They require examining our own behavior and society in ways that might be uncomfortable. But they're lessons worth learning, and the clone trooper's suffering has at least this value. It teaches us, through the clarity of fiction, what we must strive to avoid in reality. So as we come to the end of this deep dive into Clone Army ethics, remember the individual clones we've met through the stories. Remember Fives, who discovered the inhibitor chip conspiracy and died trying to warn others. Remember Rex, who fought for freedom despite being bred for servitude. Remember Echo, who survived unimaginable trauma and continued serving his brothers. Remember 99, whose physical defects made him unsuitable for combat, but whose courage was boundless. Remember Cut LaQuaine, who chose peace over war and built a family in quiet defiance of his programming. Remember the Domino Squad members who struggled through training together and died defending the republic they'd been created to serve. Remember Commander Cody, who served faithfully and then had his will stolen by an inhibitor chip, forced to shoot down the Jedi he'd fought beside for years. Remember all of them, because they represent millions of individuals whose stories we'll never know. Millions of people who deserved freedom and dignity and choice, who deserved to be more than weapons in someone else's war. Their suffering has meaning only if we learn from it, only if we carry forward a commitment to recognize personhood wherever we find it, to resist the temptation of expedient solutions that compromise fundamental principles. The Clone Army is fictional, but the ethics are real. The questions it raises don't have simple answers, but they demand to be asked. And perhaps that's the ultimate value of this story. Not that it provides comfortable conclusions, but that it forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about power, freedom, and what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of security. The Republic fell because it compromised its values. The Jedi Order was destroyed because it participated in injustice. The clones suffered because convenience mattered more than their freedom. These outcomes weren't inevitable. but they were the result of choices made by people who thought they were doing the right thing. We face similar choices all the time. The contexts differ. The stakes might seem smaller, but the fundamental questions remain the same. Will we stand for principle even when it's inconvenient? Will we recognize the humanity of people different from us? Will we refuse to participate in systems we know are wrong, even when doing so carries costs? The Clone Army story doesn't tell us what to choose, but it shows us clearly what happens when we choose wrong. When we prioritize strategy over ethics, when we treat people as tools rather than as ends in themselves. It's a warning written in the suffering of millions of enslaved soldiers, a cautionary tale about the price of moral compromise. And now, as we step back from this exploration, as we return to our own galaxy and our own lives, we carry these lessons with us. We've borne witness to the clone trooper's story. We've examined the ethical catastrophe of their creation and use. We've thought through the implications and drawn connections to our own world. What we do with that understanding is up to us. The clones can't benefit from our recognition of their personhood. They're fictional after all, but real people in our world, people whose dignity is denied, or whose freedom is constrained, or whose suffering is ignored. They can benefit if we apply these lessons. If we refuse to be the Republic's citizenry that benefited from exploitation while averting our eyes, if we refuse to be the Jedi who compromised principles for strategic necessity, if we refuse to accept that any convenience justifies creating or perpetuating systems that treat people as less than fully human, that's the challenge the Clone Army presents to us, not just to understand the story, but to be changed by it, to let it shape how we see and interact with our own world. That's when fiction truly matters, when it doesn't just entertain or even just provoke thought, but when it moves us to action, to being better than we were before we encountered it. The clones deserved better. We can't give it to them. They exist only in story, but we can give better to real people who face real exploitation, real denial of dignity, real suffering that we have the power to recognize and address. That's how we honor the story, by letting it teach us and then living differently because of what we've learned. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of Star Wars' most complex and troubling elements. If you found this exploration valuable, if it made you think about these issues in new ways or helped you see connections you hadn't noticed before, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more content like this, deep examinations of the stories we love and the questions they raise. And please share your thoughts in the comments. How do you view the Clone Army's ethics? Do you think the Jedi were justified in their choices? What parallels do you see to our own world? These discussions have value beyond any individual video, building collective understanding through shared examination of difficult questions. Until next time, may you carry forward these lessons. May you question systems that claim necessity justifies any action, and may you always recognize the full humanity of every person you encounter. The clones teach us, through their suffering, the immense cost of failing to do these things. Let's honor that lesson by refusing to repeat their tragedy in our own time and place. Sleep well, and remember, every person deserves freedom, dignity, and the right to determine their own destiny. That's not just a principle for distant galaxies. It's a truth we must uphold here and now, in the only world we actually have the power to change. Good night.